All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you for giving up your time. Thank you for your willingness to lend your voice to the dynamic conversation that we'll be having with our very distinguished panel this evening. We will actively use the chat this evening, so please place your questions and comments there. And I'd like to welcome you all to the State of Our Democracy and Where America is Headed discussion. As you all know, education can be transformative. It breaks the cycle of poverty, significantly increases voter participation, and in short, education strengthens a democracy. We are joined this evening by this distinguished panel of political leaders and influencers. Please join me in welcoming our guest panelists by placing your comments in the chat. I'll begin with introductions. Dr. Bob Stein is a fellow in urban politics, professor of political science at Rice University, has authored several books and is known as a go-to resource on anything related to voter participation and political sentiment on all issues related to Houston and Texas. Bob's current research focuses on alternative modes of elections and voting procedures in the United States. The Honorable Carroll G. Robinson is an associate professor in the political science department at the Barbara Jordan Mickey Leland School of Public Affairs at Texas Southern University, a former at-large member of Houston City Council, and former trustee of the Houston Community College System Board of Trustees. Carroll currently serves as chairman of the Texas Coalition of Black Democrats. Scott Braddock is a journalist and political analyst based in Austin, Texas. He covers the Texas legislature and politics in the Lone Star State, where he serves as editor of the Quorum Report. And Martin H. Levy is a constitutional law professor and noted scholar on the Constitution and federal jurisdiction, and comes with a wealth of knowledge as to how our system of federalism works. So with that, please continue to help me welcome our esteemed guest panelists with your comments in the chat. And we would like to kick off this discussion with Dr. Bob Stein, because Bob has done some tremendous research on voter participation, and particularly all that has happened in 2020. And so with that, Bob, I'd really like for you to kick off this discussion with a brief presentation of sorts on your findings on where things are and what have you seen through your research with voter participation in 2020.
Thank you. Let me see. I think someone to let me share a screen and I can get on. Can you share the screen?
You've got it now.
All right, let's see. There we go. All right.
Perfect.
What I thought I would do is just start with what actually happened, what actually changed, what didn't change. And there are just sort of 5 slides. And I'll tell you what my thesis is straight up. Money matters. Follow the money and follow the money back to where it originated. And I think here, where I'm going with what lies ahead, I'll let my colleagues on the panel talk more about that in terms of policy, but I think it is suggestive that the large number of corporations and businesses that have associated with Democratic and Republican candidates, and particularly candidates who have been in the federal arena, particularly congressional candidates, and their decision to pull back after last Tuesday's, for lack of any other word, attack on the Capitol, I think has its roots in campaign financing. So let's get to the real story. It's a split decision. If you look at what actually happened, the White House split. 1 extra Senate seat before the 2. This was done before the runoff in Georgia. So the Democrats have essentially picked up the Senate if, of course, our vice president-elect Kamala Harris sits as the mayor, as a speaker pro tem. The Republicans look like they picked up 12 seats. That's probably the biggest change. And most of those were seats that the Democrats, I shouldn't say most, the 12th seat is up in New York. It's still being contested, but every one of those seats that the Republicans picked up in the 2020 election, they had lost in the 2018 election. State chambers, the Republicans picked up 2, and they picked up 1 governor. I'd call this a split decision. Next slide. Excuse me. This is the turnout. I trust we all know this, but it's worth repeating 100 times. This is the highest voter turnout in over 100 years. That is stunning. What makes it more stunning is in 1900, the last time we've had a turnout exceed 66% of registered voters, most of the people who are on this Zoom would not have been allowed to vote, whether they were women and of color. Only old white men voted in 1900, not women, not men of color. And most importantly, the fact that we had 2/3 turnout is extraordinary. You have to go back to the 1960 election to even come close to that. I was 10 years old. And again, most people of color in this country could not vote. So you're talking about a denominator that is just much bigger, made up of course, because of the 26th Amendment, 18 and over. And
Bob, can I
Yeah.
interrupt you for a second? You got some folks in the waiting room. Can you let them in to join? Because I hate for them to miss this dynamic presentation.
Do I need to let them in?
But since you're the host.
Okay, how do I do? Let me. Wait room. Where do I do that? I apologize. I'm not certain.
It's okay. It should be over in the participants. If you click on the participants, you should see the long line up there, and you should see.
All right, I'll admit. I'm admitting everybody.
Fantastic.
I think that's it.
Bob, you're doing a great job, not only with the presentation, but also serving as our host.
All right, well, I have 2 more slides. So extraordinarily high turnout, a split decision, and now, oops, I apologize. I jumped ahead. Look at spending. This is even more, I think, important. In 2008, 2012, 2016, we were spending between 5.3 billion and 6.5 billion dollars on congressional and presidential. This is not state and local. This is just federal. Now, those are significant numbers. It went up almost $1.2 billion, and these are in constant dollars. Look what happened in 2020. We doubled. We more than doubled. We approached $14 billion. This is FEC data. Where did that money come from? I don't have another slide here, and I'm going to just kill the slides and just give you the answer to the question. The biggest amount of money that came in the 2020 was from corporate PACs. In 2008, 2012, 2014, 16, and 18, corporate PACs represented about 35, 34, up to 30, almost 40% of all spending. In 2020, they were over 60%. Now, why do I mention that? There are a lot of corporations. There's Apple, there's, Randall's, there's the Marriott, there's Disneyland. But in last week's debacle in the Congress and the insurrection that occurred at the Capitol, there was a large number of corporate entities that said they would no longer make campaign contributions. The only thing that could possibly change the state of American politics at this point is the flow of that money. Now, there are lots of other things that can change: our attitudes, our partisan preferences, our beliefs, but money is something that can change. I would put before you the possibility that if corporate entities of the sort that went from $5-6 billion to nearly $14 billion pull out or selectively pull out, many of the corporations targeted the 129 House Republicans that voted not to certify President-elect Biden's election, then that will have, I think, far more consequences than redistricting, election laws, or any other, what I will call threats of violence. I'll stop there and be happy to join my panelists.
Okay, wow, incredible. One, in looking at voter turnout, I mean, the largest in 100 years. I mean, that chart really was an eye opener there. And then looking at the amount of dollars that are being utilized by candidates or members of Congress from private industry. So tell me, what do you think do you think this is likely sustainable where we are? Or do you think that this is just a fluke of the time? Let's see. Are you muted here? Because I see you.
Okay. I think the short, let's see. Can I unmute myself? Can you hear me now?
You're good.
Yes.
We can hear you.
It's a real Zoom meeting now because someone has said, can you hear me now?
Yeah. I think the short answer is there's much more in the body. I could show you slides on polarization in this country, how President Trump supporters and Biden supporters see the world very differently. My sense is, my argument is that's nothing new. I can show you data going back even to the Reagan years, but more recently in the last 5 or 6 election cycles, federal election cycles, the polarization is deep, it's entrenched. The only thing that's likely to change it is what we call life cycles, the fancy word for death. A disproportionately larger number of people who have supported the president are over the age of 60, 65, and 70. So think of electors and voters as in bins. Those bins are moving to what we call leaving the electorate. And the people that are coming in behind them are disproportionately people of color, younger people by definition. And you can begin to see how that shapes. I'll give you an example. Something that no one likes to talk about among Democrats is how many Hispanics in this election voted for President Trump. But if you look at the data carefully, and I have, you look at the 18 million voters in Texas who are on the voter. This is not a poll. I want to be real clear about this. I didn't poll anybody. I did, but this isn't the results of it. I looked at every person who could have voted in November 2020. I looked at their surname to identify people whose surnames are Hispanic, and they may include people who are Hispanic but don't have a Hispanic surname, but that's not the issue. I looked at every precinct in the state, roughly close to 15,000 precincts. Shockingly, most precincts are overwhelmingly populated with voters who are Democrats and Republicans. So if you randomly pick a precinct in this state, you will see well over 70% of the people in that precinct voting one way or the other. Trump, Biden, Clinton, Trump. I also know how they voted, where, when, and shockingly, I know what primaries they voted in. So I'm pretty certain that when I randomly select a voter from the file, I know how they voted. There was a stunning increase in voter turnout, as we pointed out. Texas was no exception. We went from a tepid 57.8% in 2016 to over 63%. No, it isn't the highest we've ever had, but that was before the Civil War. So my point is, we had rapid increase. There was an increase in Hispanic surname voting over the 2016 election of over 12 points. It went from 54% in 2016 of Hispanic surname voters voting to close to 66, 64, almost 65%, 11 points. Okay. So who are these new Hispanic voters?
Right.
Were they kids under 25? No. The modal population of new Hispanic voters in our state were men under the age of 45, but over the age of 25, who were not even registered to vote in 2016.
Okay.
and didn't vote in 2018, whether or not they were registered. You with me so far?
Mhm.
It gets a little bit more complicated. The average Hispanic voter in this state had a 0.65% probability of voting for Biden. All right, you with me?
Mhm.
Among the voters who voted for the first time since 2016, who were Hispanic and somewhat around 45 or younger, a little younger, they only had a 0.54 chance of voting for Biden.
Right.
Or to put it simply, there was almost a 12, 10 or 11 point difference. People who are of Hispanic persuasion, surname, who are disproportionately male and around 45 voted at much higher rates. No, they did not vote a majority for President Trump. So be careful what you wish for. High voter turnout will bring out a new voter, and that new voter isn't experienced, hasn't voted before, isn't attentive to politics, and may choose to vote for candidates on an entirely different set of issues. Fast forward to the survey data. Not very good, I'll admit, but the exit polls show that males at around 45 and over cited, Hispanic males did not cite immigration as the number one problem, did not cite COVID as the number one problem. The number one problem for Hispanic males over the age of 45 who had no voting history before 2020 was the economy, the economy, the economy. They wanted back to work, and they saw President Trump as a wonderful miracle maker for the economy. And they saw the virus as the reason why they weren't working. They weren't afraid of the virus from a health point of view because they didn't have health insurance. If
Mm.
without jobs and employment. So what I'm getting at here is think about what the electorate looks like. This was an extraordinary election, and anybody who said higher Hispanic turnout will help the Democrats misses the point. And that's just in Texas. Go to Southern Florida or Arizona, and the world changes differently. I'm
Got
sorry to belabor a point, but it's again, there are lots of difficult questions that require more analysis.
I appreciate you sharing that perspective and what your findings are reporting. Carroll, with the January 6th unprecedented attack on the nation's capital, many have offered varied perspectives on the treatment of Black Lives Matters protesters as compared to the riotous mob that desecrated the Capitol. Through our lived experiences as Black people, we know that there is unequal treatment under the law, and this unspoken truth of America's racial divide has been televised to the world. So in our lifetime, Carol, many Americans would like to see our country emerge beyond this divide. What are ways through which our country could emerge beyond the intransigent persistence of inequality and injustice in so many facets of our life?
Dr. Reagan, I want to thank you for putting this program together tonight, because this is a very serious, specific question in the context of this broader issue of what political scientists Jefferson referred to this as an experiment in self-governance. And we're a democratic republic. And over time, Dr. Stein alluded to this, over time, race has become one of the mainstream currents in the American political system. And we are seeing some of the ongoing struggle. You know, today we're celebrating Dr. King's birthday, and I think a lot of people in America thought we had come to some kind of closure and solutions around these issues in the late 50s, early 60s, with what we refer to as the civil rights movement. But the reality is that race is still a divisive issue in America because it's so institutionalized that a lot of people take it for granted. And what we saw at the Capitol for a lot of African Americans and a lot of other Americans is that they did not believe that if that had been a Black Lives Matter, not even protest, but an insurrection, a riot, an attack on the Capitol. I was watching MSNBC 2 or 3 nights ago, and Steve Smith with the Lincoln Project made the observation that even during the Civil War, the Confederate battle flag never reached the Capitol of the United States. And on January 6th, for the first time in the history of America, a Confederate black battle flag actually got to our nation's capital. What do we do about the reality of the unequal justice system that we're living with in America? Well, we've got to start by changing the laws to address a lot of institutionalized things that have come along over the history of America. For most of us, we understand what the history of the police is. And so it's not about defund the police, it's about reforming police departments to hold officers accountable. Almost every day, we get more news reports about how many law enforcement officers were in Washington as a part of the insurrection. So we can't continue to not hold police officers and police departments accountable for bad behavior, because bad behavior is an early indicator of worse behavior if it's left unchecked. We have things like unequal, even with the latest change in the laws over the last several years, we still have disproportionate, disparate sentencing treatment. We still haven't cleaned up all the problems around the impact that marijuana has had. Cannabis is the new fancy terminology since we started legalizing it across America, but we still haven't cleaned up the records of folks who had been arrested when it was a law and order clamp down, lockdown, criminalized the Black community. We're having a conversation in America around the cash bail system, and still there are people who want to make it a quote unquote law and order as opposed to the realization that it's a criminalization of poverty. Nobody talks about the people who got out of prison on a cash bond. They paid the money. They paid the percentage. They had a bonds person and committed another crime. The whole focus of the disproportionate, distorted conversation is, oh, if you let somebody out on self-recognizance, they're let out on a small bond or a personal recognizance bond, look at the crimes they commit, because the reality, when you look at census data, Black people and Hispanics are the poorest people in America. And so it's hard if you get caught up in the criminal justice system to afford a bond. There was a great Houston Chronicle story after the last big hurricane in our area. And the story, the numbers may be off a little bit, but the story made the point that even if you were making 6 figures in the Houston region, if you missed 2 paychecks, you would fall into poverty. If you missed 2 paychecks when you were in a 6-figure household. Now imagine a family of 2 parents, multiple kids, and their average yearly income before taxes is under $40,000, $45,000 a year. The kind of hardship that, and then we also have to not only deal in the space of criminal justice reform, we also have to deal with the structural economic inequalities. And one of the things that I believe the pandemic has shown us is that our economy is going through transformation, that we don't have policymakers that are really thinking about the consequences that are occurring to our economy. And I'll finish on this last point. That same kind of transformation is going to have political consequences if you look at the data that Dr. Stein was talking about, because there's one set of corporations now, let's call them old economy entities, that are playing in this political space. And we're starting to see the emergence, quote unquote, big tech, but there'll be another group of transformative corporations that are going to be coming along. And we're seeing a shift in who the major political consequential players will be in America. So we have a lot of work. I believe we can get done. And I hope that the Biden-Harris administration will take leadership in a lot of this transformation that needs to be done to our criminal justice system and the overall inequalities in our economy.
Well, Carroll, thank you. And continue along those lines, and even expanding on the presentation that Dr. Stein presented on what, has changed, what lies ahead, what didn't change. And we're looking at, we've heard the phrase, demographics is destiny. It's often described as this phenomenon that unfurled in what we saw in Colorado, Arizona, and Georgia. When you have this shift in demographics, and Dr. Stein has spoken to that with a little bit of what has happened in Texas with the increase of Hispanic voters, but that led to a change in which party won, right, in those states. Does that continue to hold true? Do you see that? And or what do you see as a key determinant of voter support for a political party or a candidate going forward?
So, Dr. Stein opened up something we could have a elongated conversation on right after the election. I wrote a piece and I said, I think the people in the political parties are really asking themselves the wrong questions in their post-election analysis. The phrase demography or demographic is destiny in a political context. The assumption had always been that the more young people and the more minorities, Hispanics and African Americans who came into the process would automatically beneficial to Democrats. This is the reality. If you take California, New York, and I'll put Illinois in there because in 16, Clinton won Illinois by about 900,000 votes, and in 20, Biden won it by 1 million, but you could leave Illinois out of this comparison. If you take the two biggest Democratic states out of the mix, you have a really divided America. If you take Texas out, which is one of the big red Republican states, America is a closely divided place. And what you saw with this election, and that I think if you're a Democrat, you have to think beyond Trump. You have to really understand the issue mix that voters really care about. And it's going to be cut by gender, geography, so men and women, where in the country people are, and age are going to make fundamental differences going forward. So there may be some advantage for one party right now, but I think, I'm lucky because I'm still kind of connected because I have a son in his 20s. And I've watched just the different political perspective of the generations behind us. There's a Pew poll out, and they went out and surveyed a significant number of the 80 million people who did not vote. And somebody sent it to me, and my assumption why they sent it to me, like in the last week, was to look at the folks who did not vote in this election. But what really caught my attention is even among the people who voted, they were not necessarily satisfied with the two parties, and they were not necessarily satisfied with the two candidates that they had as the option for president. And so inside that poll, to me, inside of America, if the two political parties are not careful, the Republicans got to figure their way out post-Trump, and the Democrats have really got to deliver for what I'm going to call the New America coalition that they have. If they don't, in the next 4 to 8 years, you can see a lot of Democrats, especially African Americans and Hispanics, trying to figure out someplace that's really speaking to the issues that they have concerns about: the economy, the transforming nature of inequality, and the like. So I think we're at the beginning.
Some good points. I wanted to bring Scott into this conversation. Scott, do you have anything that you want to add to this conversation, particularly from your lens as a journalist?
Yeah, a very interesting conversation, Carroll and Dr. Stein. I appreciate the comments. One thing I would say about the question of money in elections, which is it's it's the mother's milk of politics, right? But it can also be the devil's brew, as the former Travis County District Attorney Ronnie Earl used to say. But it matters how you spend that money. I would start with the fact that you could take, and this is the way one Republican consultant said it to me after this election. You could take everything we just learned from this election, learn as much as you can, then immediately forget it, because you'll never get another election like that. With a game show host at the top of the ticket, a pandemic raging, making people fearful of even going to the polling place, the economy, in the ditch, and all of that. But how you spend that money really matters. And the Republicans in this state, and I cover Texas politics, I'll only talk about things that I know anything about. In Texas, Republicans were extremely smart about how they spent their money. And if you look at what happened, tens of millions of dollars spent to try to change the partisan makeup of the Texas House. And in the end result, Republicans won a seat and Democrats won a seat. So, they each lost one. So it was just a wash. What were the Republicans doing when the Democrats had the wind at their back? And they certainly did, for a variety of reasons. People, when folks are unhappy with what's going on, and Republicans and Democrats are unhappy with what's happening, basically they want to fire anybody who's in office. So it's not as though Democrats tried their best in Texas and they just didn't win because they didn't do a good job. It's also because Republicans did a very good job. Republicans were willing to go out and block walk and do field operations during a pandemic when Democrats were reticent. You had the fact that, to the point of registering new voters and what Dr. Stein was saying about Hispanics, we kind of, and those of us who cover politics for a living, the chattering class, we kind of thought that Republicans in Texas had topped out on how many Republican voters there are here. But they did a very sophisticated voter registration effort while Democrats were also doing that. There's a reason beyond just interest in politics that there were so many new voters. Republicans were able to register at least 300 to 350,000 new voters in Texas, including a lot of people who were Hispanic. And the way they do these voter drives is they stand outside of a Lowe's or a Home Depot or Walmart or wherever, and they ask you a few questions like, what's the most important thing to you? And when they say it's the economy, they might ask them another question like, what do you think about whether a woman should have a right to an abortion? And what do you think about Second Amendment rights? Do you think your Second Amendment rights are being threatened right now? If they answer those questions, correctly according to Republican philosophy, well, then they say, oh, well, can I sign you up to vote? I mean, you should be registered, right? And Democrats have a version of that as well. So when we think about the money that's being spent, it's important, but I would emphasize that Republicans did a good job of talking about the healthcare issue, which they did not do in previous election cycles. They basically made that a wash, and Republicans added on top of that. They took this, issue of, and hope we'll talk more about this, but the issue of Black Lives Matter, the protests over the summer, and what did they do? They turned it into an issue of supporting the police, no matter what police do. Which is sort of a political trick to do that when the energy was with the other side of that argument in the summer. And then the other thing about demographics, I think Carroll spoke very well about it. And this has been true as long as I've been covering politics, about 20 years. And I've always heard this. I mean, you've all heard this. You're all very politically astute people who pay attention to this. I see a lot of my folks here tonight, Judge Englehart, Otis, a few other folks at Gale. I see everybody there. In 20 years of doing this, I've always heard demographics is destiny. It is not. Demographics represents opportunity, right? So when the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, a very conservative Republican, talked after the 2018 election about all these new people who were voting in Texas, he's probably the smartest politician in the state. I don't think he has a lot of fans on this call tonight, but the Lieutenant Governor is a very smart politician. And what he said at the time was, look, you got all these new people voting. We went from the 2014 midterm to the 2018 midterm with double the number of voters in those midterms from 14 to 18. Who are all these new people? There were at least 500,000 people in 2018 who voted for Beto O'Rourke and then voted for Greg Abbott. So that doesn't mean that they were hardcore Democrats. They were new to the process, and they maybe didn't like President Trump. They'd have reasons for that. They didn't like Senator Cruz. They'd have lots of reasons for that. But a lot of them voted for Republicans down the ballot. So these are people who need to be talked to, engaged with. That's why conversations like this are so important, and conversations among people who are politically active are so important. It's always about the conversation, having the conversation with people. Maybe you don't agree with them about one big thing, but maybe there's other things you agree with them about. And I think from a political spending and organizing standpoint, those things cannot be, it can't be overstated how important they are.
Well, thank you, Scott. And Martin, let's pull you into this conversation and build off of what Scott has shared. You know, the U.S. Constitution has been assaulted. It has been tested by more by President Trump than perhaps anyone else in our American history. We've learned that a lot of things we believe to be enshrined in the Constitution were merely implied, established norms, gentleman's agreement of sorts, but not expressed in the Constitution. So Martin, what in your opinion needs to be addressed most urgently with our Constitution?
Well, I mean, you know, politics kind of decides the Constitution too. And the impeachment issue and how it is played out would certainly be the most dynamic constitutional issue, I think, in the Trump presidency. And I think that's absolutely accurate. And it's an area I've had a chance to work on. And really, I'd be most interested in answering any question that anybody participating on our discussion might have concerning impeachment and where we're at.
Well, we're taking the questions in the chat, and we're going to get to that point of the conversation after we finish up with some more of the pre-submitted questions.
I think what's most important to realize is that impeachment is political. It was intended to be political. In the Nixon case, Justice Douglas commented in regard to the issue of the criteria for an impeachable offense that it would be what the House of Representatives determined as such. And of course, as it's played out now, as it has historically as well, its political nature is fairly obvious. I think what's most interesting right now is the timing of the present impeachment makes it historically novel. The entire issue now really isn't going to be removal from office, because if it's debated at trial, it will take place after the impeached president has been removed. So if you want to talk about political, here's the present Republican circumstance. Do we ride with Trump or do we not ride with Trump? That's literally is what it's on everyone's table. Now, if someone asks me, can you remove a president in quotes from office after he's removed? Okay. The answer would be that's never been determined, and if likely will be determined by the Senate. Given a likely Supreme Court's response would be that the power to impeach is a sole power grant and likely would be determined by the Senate. But what's most interesting about it are the provisions that would be a future ban from office. So what we're going to decide within the next couple of weeks is what will Trump's role be within the Republican Party? And what the Republicans are going to decide, because they'll be needed for a 2/3 removal, a vote, to occur, will be, do we want to eliminate him as a potential candidate in the future? Because the Constitution does give them the authority to include within such the inability to hold office in the future.
Well, Martin, so along those lines, do you think any of the seated Congress members could face consequences for the role that they played?
Well, I think they could. I think it's doubtful, to be honest with you. Okay. But anybody, we've never had an impeachment in that context, but federal officers can be impeached. We've had mostly judges impeached and removed. No president has ever been removed from office, although as most Americans are aware of, we've had 2 impeachments. I had occasion to work on the Nixon impeachment with the late Barbara Jordan, and I noticed today that someone said, well, couldn't they have determined that even though Nixon resigned, that he could never hold the presidency again, creating a parallel and arguing, since they didn't, isn't that a precedent for that not occurring? The problem would be that the president now constitutionally can only hold 2 terms, and Nixon had his 2 terms. Fair enough? So that wasn't even an issue at the time, but it certainly is today.
Unprecedented times, unprecedented decisions we're having to make, Martin. And so I want to go back to Scott here. Mm-hmm. Scott, there's this massive proliferation of news.
Fake news too.
Sources, including online, print, and television, right? Where
I've got my prop here, Dr. Flowers.
Yes.
The world needs journalists.
Yes, we do. So there's no real journalists. There's no real journalism going on, right? So where does this leave us in terms of being able to establish reliable news sources and all the important relevance of unadulterated journalism?
I'll tell you, a friend gave me this right after the riot at the Capitol, and with all of this anger that was going on at the media, and it's been fomented for a long time, of course. And you would think it's kind of funny as just a T-shirt that you might wear somewhere, but I mean, it's a sign of the times, right? I could wear that to a rally for President Trump, and I might be assaulted for wearing it. Right. I mean, they wear shirts at Trump rallies that say rope tree journalist, some assembly required. Right. That sort of thing. The role of the media, it's something I've thought a lot about, and I'm not the best in the world at talking about my own profession, but I'll give it a shot. I usually think that people don't really care about the ins and outs of exactly how we do what we do. But in doing this for about 20 years, as I mentioned, most of the time that I have been in journalism was in broadcast news, radio stations in Houston and Dallas and elsewhere. And I like to tell people, if you work in radio and you've never been fired, you're boring. Right. Now, I've lost a couple jobs in radio. And one of the arguments that I've never made ever was that I was entitled to a specific microphone, which is what so many people are doing right now. You see all of these people who are being taken off of Twitter or Facebook, the president and some of his supporters who have been spreading so much misinformation. That's one way to say it. Lies is another way to say it. And they claim that they have a right to a specific microphone, right? The president has a right to be on Twitter, and he has a right to be on Facebook, but he doesn't. These are private entities and they can do what they want, right? And all across the South, I'll take it to the race discussion. All across the South and in other parts of America, businesses to this day have signs up that say, we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. And you know why those signs are there. Right. And you know why they were. And so you have all these folks who feel so entitled. When I started as a broadcaster and as a journalist, it was never anything that was said to me by any of my elders in the business that you have a right to be on a specific radio station, a right to be on a specific website, or anything like that. The kinds of training that I received was more along the lines of being responsible and telling people and giving people good information. So when I hear all these folks talk about how the president incited that riot and the president Senator Cruz also contributed to that riot, and then I have people say, well, go back and listen to the speeches that President Trump gave, or that his son gave, or that the Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, gave before that riot happened in Washington. Some of the president's defenders would say, well, if you listen to the words, they didn't actually say go down there and break into the building. They didn't actually say go down there and attack anybody. But no one is saying that they did. I mean, they used some language that was inflammatory, of course, but they created an environment in which the riot would happen by lying to people. Right? They created the environment by telling people something that was not true. The loudest applause for any senator as they were speaking on the day that they were going to certify the election results was for a Republican senator, Mitt Romney, who said that you would be honoring and respecting those people who are out there protesting. You'd be honoring them by telling them the truth. And that in America, one of the reasons we all like living here, that no bullets are fired. I think the president talked about that we have a peaceful transfer of power, and that we do have those people in the media who are there to call balls and strikes on what's real, what's not. Look, one of the things that we have to do in media, I think, is some serious self-reflection. There are people who are liberals and people who are conservatives and every stripe in between along the ideological spectrum. There are people who have legitimate complaints about media and what we do. And so, and we can't just dismiss when conservatives say that, well, MSNBC is liberal and CNN is liberal. You can't just dismiss it out of hand because there are some things that happen on CNN, for example, where some of the hosts roll their eyes as they ask questions of conservatives, or they start their show. The evening shows on CNN start with opinion pieces by the news anchors. Right. So we have some questions to ask of ourselves as well. And of course, all of these, so you don't have to. I watch Fox News Channel as well. And on that channel, I mean, a guy like Sean Hannity is just lying. You look at the fact that maybe media is starting to clean up its act a little bit when Westwood One, for example, and Cumulus Media, just the other day, they own a lot of talk radio stations, I think more than 400 radio stations, and they air conservative talk show hosts who have been spreading this lie that the election was stolen. And the corporate, and I've worked in professional radio 15 years, I've never seen a corporate directive like this. They told their on-air talent to stop telling people the election was stolen, or we may end up parting ways with you. There has to be this conversation about no one being entitled to specific microphones. And even though you have a right to speak, you don't have a right to have anybody hear you. You just don't. You have to fight for that, right? You have to fight for a platform. You don't just have it handed to you. And by the way, how peaceful has it been since, and how many people feel that their whole life is a little more even keel because the president's not on Twitter at 5 a.m. every day, whipping people up.
You make a good point there. That's for sure. It has been quiet and calm. I think some people are lost because they don't have excitement. They've gotten accustomed to it. And so great points. Thanks so much, Scott, for sharing their perspective, from a journalist point of view. I want to take a few questions now from the audience here. And Martin, you were ready, so I'm going to fire this one up with you. There's a question here from one of our guests in the audience. They'd like to know what legal course can be taken for the members of Congress that voted against confirmation of the vote after the attack of the Capitol. They also stoked the violence and supported the public who chose to participate. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, their circumstance is political, and politics is generally the recourse for politicians. They can be censored. A censor is a resolution that doesn't have any particular legalized meaning other than, in quotes, the browbeating. so they could be censured. They could be expelled. We have a significant Supreme Court case, Powell versus McCormick. Gee, I'm going to test everybody's age. I don't think there are too many people around here that probably remember Adam Clayton Powell. You should remember him. He was an earmark in New York, and quite a character. And because of the politics in that era, by a majority vote, he wasn't seated. And the court, which generally refrains from being involved in politics of that nature, held it unconstitutional because they said that because of bad behavior, that required him being expelled, which is 2/3 vote. And those are there and could be applied, to the senators. But my guess would be, not likely, to occur, and their repercussions are likely to be political. And I don't think that will go away. But I wanted to add one thing that may not be constitutional, in quotes, but I think is unique about politics in America today. We've gone through a long period, my lifetime, and I've only read about it prior to my lifetime, where racist and fascist and Nazi-like views, people of that persuasion had to be quiet. And even when they were quiet, is there anybody here who didn't think 30 to 40% of Americans could have held that view, and historically a larger number in the South? But I don't think it's historically innocuous that following the election of our first African-American president, we get a president that follows, that can politically play upon those fascist political tendencies. And one thing for sure that has occurred, they can come back out of the woods. May have been in the woods in my lifetime, but before they were not. And they are out of the woods. And there are more examples than what happened in the Capitol. And one of the dominant questions in America today is, where will that lead in the future? I can tell you this, Trump got more votes than Hitler. Hitler, when he became chancellor in the German democracy at that time, had 37% of the vote. And the corporate Germans, and we have notes to prove it, decided that they'd use their political party to give him a majority in the German parliament and put him in office with records that say we can control it. Well, guess what? He made a lot of money for him, but they didn't control him. And that is our future. Where will that lead? What is that number? They are out of the woods. Trump has licensed them. Even if I suggested earlier the Republicans try to deny him running for office again, doesn't mean when he creates his own media outlet that he won't continue to play upon them. And all of that, one thing we know for sure politically, is in our future, in my opinion.
Thank you, Martin. And it's what it speaks to is the question of education of our population. And Bob, I spoke earlier, about education being transformative, breaking the cycle of poverty. It's significantly increasing voter participation, and it strengthens our democracy. We have a question here from our audience, Bob, that I would love to hear your response to. The question here is, how has education or lack of education played a role in getting us to where we are now? And how do you see public education, both in the K-12 and post-secondary space, contributing to the functionality of our democracy going forward?
Well, there are books on this. The short answer would be that years of education have been highly correlated with all the things that Martin Carroll talked about, which is upward social mobility, greater participation in the political process, not necessarily liberal or conservative. There doesn't seem to be any evidence over time that higher levels of education lead you to be more likely to be a Democrat or Republican, although you tend to be much more supportive of democratic systems of government. Of course, that is a debatable question as to what constitutes people's perceptions. The two things that matter most probably in education is that it reduces the enormous social cleavages in a society. Of that, there is no question. So for instance, it's not an accident that men and women of color have lower levels of education. As a consequence of those lower levels of education, they're more susceptible to problems, but the least of which I think Carroll talked about. The epidemic, the pandemic obviously adversely affects men and women of color in a whole host of ways. No health insurance, higher proportion of population with children without health insurance. Populations with lower levels of education tend to be employed in service sector jobs, which cannot take a day off or an hour off to work at home like I do in a privileged situation. They have to be the frontline providers at things like grocery stores, or for that matter, even stop and goes in McDonald's. So the consequence of education reduces the social disparities, which creates an environment in which the types of political polarizations that we're observing can't take root, not as easily. I should say they can take root, not as easily. I could go on, but the bottom line is that education, Bill Hobby, who many of us probably remember as our last Democratic lieutenant governor, and I had the privilege of teaching with him for many years. He said one thing to me that never leaves my mind. He said, if you're running a budget in the state and you have $1 to spend it on education. There's nothing you can do better. You don't have to spend it on traffic control, flood control, policing, and prisons. If you spend it on education, everything else pales in comparison. If you educate a population, they're less likely to commit crimes. If you educate a population, they're less likely to be sick. They're less likely to need health care. They're less likely to engage in behaviors that are detrimental, whether it's drug usage, speeding, or for that matter, inappropriate uses of weaponry. Education is probably the best single investment we can make in democratic systems.
Thank you so much, Bob. I totally agree with you there. And with that, I saw a little chit chat in the chat with our panelists. I would like for Carroll and Scott to weigh in on whether you think the Democrats can win Texas in 2022, or do you think we'll have to wait till 2030?
Carroll, did you want to start that? Did you have thoughts on it? Or is he's on mute, I think.
You're on mute. Let's unmute you. Let's see here.
Carroll can't. They muted him.
He might have to be unmuted by the host.
No, I got it.
There he is.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
No, Scott and I were having this exchange because that's, let me just touch on something that Bob said and then go to the 2022 question.
Yeah.
I absolutely believe education is foundational, and we have got to look at some kind of civics back into the education system in an objective way about how our systems function and the importance of the individual participating in the system all the way up through college and beyond. Let's call it a sophisticated version of Schoolhouse Rock for older America, and i.e. when you leave formal education, we still need to keep educating people about the importance of our system. That said, the question I was really asking was, do Democrats, or what should Democrats be looking at if they really want to talk about playing to win in Texas in 2022, 2024? So I'll kick it over.
Well, the 2022 and 2024 questions, statewide level, I would go back to the 2014 election and take it through 2020 and then up to 2022, and just on the numbers. As the voter participation has increased, you only saw one election, which doesn't make for a trend, but you only saw one election in which Democrats came this close to winning a statewide election. It may be depressing, but I like to say, I'm a journalist, not a therapist, so I'm just here to give you the facts. How you feel about it is up to you. In the 2018 election and in the 2020 election, you still have statewide a baseline for Republicans of about 10 to 11 point margin of victory. So people are thinking of 2018 and they think, well, Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke, they were within 2 points. I think there were a lot of things going on in that race at the very top of the ticket that are not going to be replicated or replicated soon. And the same thing is true in 2020, and it changes the top of the ticket, but only slightly. In 2018, you had basically a convergence of 3 things. You had, and 2 of them you could see coming. One is backlash to President Trump. And the reason I go back to 2014 is because as I mentioned before, you doubled voter participation from 14 to 18, those 2 midterms, right? So you go to 2018 and you have 500,000, 500,000 people who voted for Beto O'Rourke and Greg Abbott. Abbott beat his Democratic opponent by 13 points, right? At the top of the ticket, you had those 3 things. You had backlash to President Trump. You can see that coming. Backlash to Senator Cruz. You could see that coming too. I didn't say this. A Republican colleague of his said that he has the most punchable face in the United States Senate. There are plenty of Republicans who don't like Ted Cruz. So that was going on. And then you had this Beto O'Rourke effect, who before 2018, unless you were from El Paso, most people didn't even know who Beto O'Rourke was. He kind of came onto the political scene and lit the world on fire, kind of the Mick Jagger of politics, dancing on top of the tables and all that sort of stuff. I don't see Democrats getting another candidate like that anytime soon, although who knows, could be wrong. But even with that going on and creating a 2 or 3 point race at the top of the ticket, you still had a 13 point margin of victory for Greg Abbott in the governor's race. And then if you go to 2020, you do have the presidential number shrink again from 9 points in 2016 down to 6 points or so in 2020. But the very next race, the U.S. Senate race, John Cornyn beats his Democratic opponent by 10 points. So you're still looking at Greg Abbott and John Cornyn style Republicans, with about a 10 point margin of victory, 10 to 11 or 12 point margin of victory. I think the Republicans are maybe learning the lesson over the course of these elections. And this is a good thing, by the way. Competitive elections are good for democracy. Republicans are learning that to not lose, they have to hold the middle in Texas. It's not that they can be the most right-wing politicians. Ted Cruz is one of the most right-wing politicians, and he almost lost his race. Dan Patrick, our lieutenant governor, one of the most right-wing politicians, he almost lost his race too. But those Republicans who are more in the mold of, I'll just use the old, the old Ronald Reagan example, those who are the ones who would say, the person who agrees with me 80% of the time is not my 20% enemy. Those Republicans who want to work with Democrats, if you look at the candidacies of Republicans all over the state, at the statewide level with John Cornyn and with those Republicans who held their seats in Congress and held their seats in suburban districts in the Texas House, their message was that they were bipartisan problem solvers who want to work with Democrats. Right. The Democratic message was, that was for the most part, the Democratic message was, these guys are all right-wing lunatics and you should fire them. Well, that didn't work out. But Republicans over the course of these past election cycles are learning that lesson. In 2019, in the Texas legislature, we saw probably the closest thing that we'll get in a long time to responsible, even-handed governance, when they focused simply on school finance and property taxes, and they didn't let the red meat right-wing issues distract them in 2019. there was a reason for that. They didn't suddenly just become reasonable. It's because in 2018, they had a close election, right? And so they were very worried. And I think as you move forward, you're going to see the Republicans move back in that direction, unless they want to have to spend millions and millions of dollars to just hold what they have in Texas. So if you look at who's going to be on the ballot statewide in 2022, maybe it's not Greg Abbott. Maybe he's done running. I'm not making any predictions, but whoever's going to be in that spot is going to be somebody who either adheres to that lesson of governing and campaigning more in the middle, or somebody who's going to move more to the right wing, which ends up making the election more competitive. But in Texas, there's such a built-in structural advantage for Republicans, particularly in those non-presidential races. That's very hard to see the Democrats being able to get there in 2 years.
Carroll, did you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, the only thing I would say, it was an interesting point, is it sounds like Patrick may be the most, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick may be the most vulnerable person, or a lot of the speculation is that Governor Abbott runs again, but he gets primaried by somebody in the Republican Party along the lines of, let's call it the Trump faction versus the moderate faction, and the possibility that he may get beat in the Republican primary. And based on what we just heard from Scott, if he were to get beat by somebody more out on the right, if Democrats have a decent candidate in the governor's race running against a more right-wing gubernatorial candidate from the Republican side, there may be some possibility, or it may be at least a closer race.
Mm-hmm.
So that'll be interesting to watch. I would say this too, and I'd like to hear Scott's thought. One of the things, and it goes back to what Dr. Murray spoke about in his opening presentation, I think Democrats have got to engage Texans, let me not just say voters, Texans, because as new people come on the rolls to vote and show up, if they haven't been engaged with, you don't have an opportunity to have them drawn to you. I don't think you can wait until the year of an election anymore. And so it will be fascinating to see what Republicans and Democrats do this year in terms of investing in preparing for 2022. Scott, what are you hearing and seeing out there in terms of outreach?
Right now, Democrats are trying to pick up the pieces. I don't want to sound all doom and gloom for Democrats in Texas. I would say that I'm constantly surprised. Hope springs eternal. I remember in that 2014 election, $40 million was spent on behalf of Wendy Davis to lose to Greg Abbott by 21 points. And at that time, I thought, wow, they'll never get any money again. This is a disaster. Then, of course, Beto O'Rourke raises $80 million for his U.S. Senate run against Ted Cruz. That's the most, to that point, is the most expensive U.S. Senate race anywhere in America in history to that point in 2018. And then after this, where tens of millions of dollars were spent on behalf of Democrats trying to win seats in the Texas House of Representatives, and they didn't pick up one net new seat. Once again, I'm here just, sort of slack-jawed and thinking, is this ever going to turn into anything? And can they make a case again for spending money in Texas? There's always some argument that can be made as far as why Democrats are going to do well in Texas. And there's a whole industry built around that, of course. I think that, having the log jam at the top of the ticket break if Governor Abbott does not run again, it creates an opportunity. I think he's fine in a primary. I would say this: if let's say Allen West, the current Republican Party chairman, there's a lot of chatter about whether he would run against Greg Abbott as part of that Trump faction. If he was to do that, I think he would get just politically slaughtered by Greg Abbott. He's got $40 million in the bank. He's still very popular among the Republican Party, even though he's not as right wing as they would like. And I think a lot of the question comes down to, as was said earlier by I think by Martin, and Dr. Stein might have touched on it, with whether or not President Trump, once he's former President Trump, is he still really a factor in the Republican Party, or does he kind of fade into obscurity? I'm not sure. I don't know the answer, and nobody knows that. Anybody who does thinks that they do is probably getting out ahead over their skis. There'll be some other character on that in that part of the party, but I would say President Trump is such a singular figure. There's no other Republican just like him. If you look around the country, there are a lot of Republican candidates who are trying to take on this sort of Trumpy way of campaigning and talking. And I mean, not just the members of Congress that we see in Washington who are repeating a lot of the things that he says, but I mean people who are running for city councils and county commissioners courts in parts of the country where they're trying to sound and look and behave like President Trump. It doesn't work for the rest of these guys. He's a very singular figure, and he's not Republican. I'll just say he was a Democrat and contributed to Democrats for years. That doesn't mean he's a traditional Democrat and would agree with people on this Zoom. That's not the point. But he was brand new to the Republican Party. This is a new thing. And I think there's a real question to be asked about whether this is the beginning of something, as was kind of said by, I think, by Martin. Is this kind of the beginning of something where the Republicans kind of keep going in this direction? Or are we seeing right now the end of something? Even if let's say they don't vote to remove the president or vote to preclude him from ever running for office again, I would still look at the vote count on that and see how many Republicans are willing to stick their neck out to say, we need to excise this from the party today so that we're not putting up with this 4 years from now, because it's causing headaches for Republicans all over the place. And I would caution Democrats, not just in Texas, but around the country, even though Democrats were able to win the White House, there are more Republicans now in the U.S. House. There are the same number of Republicans, roughly, that are in the U.S. Senate, as was mentioned earlier, that they have, a divided Senate now. And Republicans did pretty well in their elections around the country. It was a rejection of Trump. I think no question, according to the popular vote and the Electoral College, no matter what anybody says on Fox News Channel, it was a rejection of Trump, but it was not a rejection of Republican and conservative governance. Republicans did really well in this election. And so I think trying to project forward what that's going to mean in Texas and around the rest of the country, it's really difficult until you get that question answered, right? Of do Republicans still have to put up, they'll have to put up with primaries from people to their right, but are they going to have to put up with Trump Republicans? I don't know if it's that durable. I don't know if we get 18 months from now and we're looking at candidates who are running, challenging people successfully in the Republican Party on the idea that they didn't, stay to the bitter end when President Trump was saying the election was stolen.
So with that, Scott, I'm going to go pivot over to Martin. Martin, we're talking about President Trump here. What are your thoughts? The audience would like to know on the pardoning situation, him pardoning himself, his family, the rioters. What are your thoughts on the self-pardon?
Well, there's no constitutional history with the Supreme Court in regard to the breadth of presidential pardon. The Constitution's lack of comment really beyond the granting of the authority isn't particularly helpful, but has generally been viewed as that power is very broad. One point that I almost have never heard made when people talk about the debates at convention that I'm going to make, we have no record of the American Constitutional Convention. When someone talks to you about the debates, that is not authentic, period. The individual in charge of keeping the record did not keep it. It was never made available. We have the Federalist Papers, which are a wonderful kind of political background written to get it adopted. We have notes, but the individuals who took notes, that's their recollection, their bias in terms of what happened. Madison's are viewed as best, and we've had some historians make great efforts in that regard. But the general view of the pardon was its expropriation from its availability to English monarchs, and that the intent was to allow an authority to exercise some mercy for someone who had been convicted and sentences and was going to be sentenced, and that's its purpose. To guess how the Supreme Court will decide it isn't easy, but my job is to guess. So, and contrary to Steve, I can be wrong. Okay, I'm not a journalist. So anyway, I think this would be legitimate. It's fair to say the framers did not want a monarchy. It's fair to say the framers did not intend the president to be above the law. In order for the president to pardon himself and have that be legitimate, the Supreme Court, who is the ultimate arbiter of our Constitution, they are the most powerful authority in that regard in America. In the end, the most political body, even though it's legal. My guess would be there'd be no way you could legitimize constitutionally a presidential pardon to himself. It would be contrary to purpose and would defeat the premise that we don't have a monarch and no one is above the law. But, I'm just hypothesizing. We have no history and no other knowledge, and we can only hypothesize.
All right, thank you, Martin. So with that, as we are preparing for our closing remarks from panelists, if you can just give us two minutes, if you could, or less, of your closing remarks, those burning thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience. And we'll start over here with you, Bob.
I'll limit my things to two things. In 2010, the Texas House was redistricted by then Speaker Strauss. The Democrats, at the end of that redistricting, held only 50 of 150 seats. In 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, in every election cycle since 2010, the Democrats picked up seats and the Republicans lost, to the point where they were 8 or 9 seats away. Now we do redistricting this time. But what I like to point out, I'm not trying to be optimistic, is that in every one of those elections that transpired between 210 and 220, the Democrats did or did not put up strong candidates. The Democrats did or did not have good funding. What gave them those seats was the inevitable shift in demography. And that shift is just continuing. It's like a glacier. It's hard to see. It's always difficult to measure. But the simple fact of the matter is Texas is a blue state. The only thing holding it back is what held back the South from becoming a red state after 1964. And that is, of course, gerrymandering and redistricting and the institutions. Unfortunately for the Republicans, many of those opportunities have been actually reduced by the demography, except for the fact that you don't have Section 5. So my sense is the Democratic fortunes are looking brighter. The biggest problem I have is they have no candidates. They have no bench. They have no bullpen. When you put up a Wendy Davis, we may all like her, but she was an incredibly weak candidate. 40, 80, 90, $1 billion would not have made Wendy Davis a better candidate. And I happen to personally think the same is true of Beto O'Rourke. When you run against a Ted Cruz, money isn't always a necessary and sufficient condition. Candidacy, ability to reach out and reach across that divide. Remember, Wisconsin went for Trump by 20,000 votes in 2016. In 2021, it went for Biden by 20,000. This wasn't a case of voters being persuaded. It was all about turning out your base. And I think what you got with the Republicans now is a monotonically declining base. And for the Democrats, I think Georgia is your picture. Those are the states where that base is increasing. But finding decent candidates is what the Republicans did in 2020 for those Texas House races. Many of the Democratic candidates simply did not make muster. And by that, I simply mean they didn't hold elective office. They hadn't run before. They hadn't raised money, meaning there's no base. There's no bench. And until you can start moving candidates from county commissioners, state reps into congressional races, it gets really hard to put up quality candidates.
Thank you, Bob. Carroll, you have the floor.
Well, let me do this. Let me thank you again for pulling this conversation together because it's so vitally important. And I think a lot of us have to engage in conversation with folks to really think about what it means to protect and maintain the democracy above the partisan political part of it. So that's important. The pure political part of it, you know, I think demographics will matter, but I don't think it's going to matter in the way people think. In this sense, I think younger voters, newer voters are less inclined to accept the hypocrisy of politics. You can't say one thing and do another. And we probably need a Stacey Abrams type candidate in Texas. And what I mean by that is somebody that's going to stay around, even if they don't win. Getting elected is not what the victory is. Building the infrastructure is what the victory is. And I think the Democratic Party in Texas and the candidates that ran statewide in 2020 and 2018, including but not limited to Beto, have really got to redouble the leadership effort in infrastructure building. And at some point, the National Party will come to the strategic conclusion that if they invest in taking Texas off the board, like eventually what happened in Georgia this cycle, it locks down the Electoral College in such a way that the presidency will be held by the Democratic Party for probably 5, 6, 8 cycles to come. But that's a strategic decision. And the last thing I'll say is we will see a lot of constitutional law continue to be made. I don't think people realize all the new law that was made by all the election challenges, including the election challenges by Trump, and they will come back to shape election law for the foreseeable future going forward. And so will this Trump impeachment. So thank you to all the panelists and thank you to Dr. Reagan for hosting us.
Thank you, Carroll. Martin, you have the floor.
Well, I would say two things. One is a concern and one is a basis of optimism. I have one concern a little bit related to a discussion I had earlier about this presidency, and that is the fact that the deployment almost per se of Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, was per se put into practice almost unnoticed. The lie enough, the fake news, that's all Goebbels. Now, I don't think Stephen Miller and Bannon would want Marty Levy speaking for them. But I think if they were here and heard me, their answer would be, but why can't you use Goebbels to achieve good things? Our goals are good. That problem was what they were trying to achieve. But I'm very concerned about it, individuals like Miller or Bannon, and I'm very concerned about what it might mean for our future. Hey, that being said, you want to feel good? Given our history, given lynching, given voter suppression, we just elected a Black man and a Jew as senators from the state of Georgia. That ain't a reason to smile. I don't know what is. Thank you for the program and for the invitation.
Thank you, Martin. And Scott, to close out.
Well, I appreciate the insights tonight from Martin, from Carroll, from Bob, and especially big thanks to Dr. Flowers for pulling this all together. If we were all in person, which someday I hope we can all get in the same room and do something like this is where I would ask everybody to give a big round of applause to Dr. Flowers for getting this conversation going. It is so needed, and something that, you know, as well, those of us on screen can do that. Look, I think that in the final analysis, without getting too much into the politics of the state or the nation, I want to say just something about you know, where we're at as far as a culture and how we get our information. I think that these kinds of conversations need to start happening when, because education was brought up earlier. It's got to start happening when kids are small, kids are little. Talk to them about what real information is. Talk to them about having real conversations with people who don't look like you. Talk to the kids about you know, figuring out what are the ways to hold not only the people in power accountable, but to hold themselves accountable and to hold their neighbors accountable for the kind of decisions we're making in our communities. Because look, we do have, you know, all the comparisons to Hitler and Goebbels aside, in this country, we still have a government that is reflective of what people chose. And somehow there was one of those images that people put out on Twitter or Facebook, one of those memes where they said, you know, it was a picture of a little puppy, and then there was a picture of a rabid dog, and the puppy was what video games did to me, and then the rabid dog was what Fox News did to my parents. And we got to hold our own family members accountable. You know, people are complaining about the way folks do things, but we've got to hold each other accountable, and we've got to love each other. That's what Dr. King talked about. And I'd like to close out for those of you who, it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat and a liberal or a conservative or a Republican. I think that the words hold true if you're trying to make any progress, is if you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you've got to keep moving. These kinds of conversations are part of keeping moving. And thank you so much for having it.
Thank you, Scott. And with that, I'd like to make some acknowledgments here. Judge Mike Engelhardt, Judge Deborah Davis, Council Member Carolyn Evans Shabazz, whom I have the honor of following in her footsteps at Houston Community College as trustee, finishing out her term. My colleagues, trustees, Robert Glazier, Adriana Tamaz, Rhonda Skillen-Jones, thank you guys so much for joining us. And I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you to our esteemed panelists once again, Dr. Bob Stein, Honorable Carroll G. Robinson, Scott Braddock, and Martin H. Levy for sharing your perspective on the state of our democracy and where America is headed. Thank you, Shakira Dennis, and the entire team at Next Wave Strategies for serving as the host engine. To our audience, thank you for your participation, your selflessness, and for standing strong. I surmise from the discussion today that we must do more than be optimistic, that we must be able to do the work, be willing to do the work to bend our future forward towards justice, equity, and inclusion. There is no democracy with a miseducated and misguided populace. We must create the absolute best among us. I bid you all a good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening, everybody. Be
Thank you.
safe.